When Brendon Grimshaw announced he was going to restore a forgotten island in the Indian Ocean, alone, by hand, nobody wished him well. The island had sat empty for close to 50 years. No birds sang there, no paths cut through it. The undergrowth was so thick and tangled that coconuts falling from the palms never reached the ground. They lodged in layers of invasive weeds halfway down. Rats ran everything. And Grimshaw's idea was to show up with a shovel, a young local fisherman, and zero training in ecology, and somehow turn this wreck into something alive again. Everyone assumed he'd gone mad. He was a newspaper editor from Yorkshire. His entire career had been spent running newsrooms across East Africa, not rehabilitating islands. He had no qualifications, no backing from any government, no institutional support of any kind. All he had was £8,000, a decision he couldn't undo, and a belief that a dead piece of land could recover if one person was stubborn enough to do the labor. The investors thought it was hilarious. The logic of the market was obvious. Buy the island, put up a resort, turn a profit. What you absolutely do not do is spend decades hand-planting thousands of trees on a rock that nobody wants. Grimshaw paid no attention to any of it. And 46 years after he first stepped onto Moyenne Island, the place he dragged back from ruin became the smallest national park on Earth. Moyenne Island in 1962 was deceiving. It lies about 4.5 kilometers from Mahé, a small thing, barely 400 by 300 meters. The last person to live there had left in 1915. For nearly half a century after that, nobody set foot on it, and in those decades the island didn't mend itself. It fell apart. Invasive species had choked out almost everything native. The undergrowth was so dense that physically crossing the island couldn't be done. Only 4 native tree species still hung on. No birds nested there. Rats had overrun the place, devouring any eggs or small animals that might have survived. The forest floor was a web of invasive roots that shut out light and water and killed any native seed before it could establish itself. The rats didn't simply eat what remained. They actively blocked recovery, consuming seeds the moment they dropped, keeping the spiral of decline spinning year after year. It was not a jungle. It was a broken machine, stuck in a loop of its own collapse. A dying island can look perfectly healthy. The growth is thick, it's green, but everything on it is wrong. The wrong plants smother the right ones. The wrong animals, rats, stop anything native from getting a foothold. Without birds carrying seeds, native plants can't spread. Without native plants, the birds have no reason to come back. The system traps itself in failure. Every year without someone stepping in made the next year harder. The weeds pushed further. The rats multiplied. The soil hardened under root networks that had no place there. Abandoned, Moyenne wasn't going to heal. It was going to deteriorate, and that deterioration was completely invisible to the people who should have been paying attention. By the early 1960s, tourism was flooding into the Seychelles. Hotels were going up fast. Investors were snapping up land and building as quickly as they could. The economic thinking was straightforward and self-reinforcing. The island's natural beauty was exactly what wealthy travelers paid to experience, so the obvious play was to develop fast and capture that revenue before competitors arrived. Conservation didn't enter the equation. No government program existed for islands like Moyenne. No environmental organization had drawn up a restoration plan. Across the Seychelles, the handful of attempts at land protection had been starved of funding, loosely enforced and quietly shelved once the development money spoke loudly enough. One marine reserve had been formally designated, but received no enforcement budget and no personnel. The institutional stance wasn't that conservation was impossible. It was that conservation was costly, generated no financial return, and demanded expertise that nobody was volunteering for a 24-acre patch of overgrown rock. The smart money had already reached its verdict. Nature reserves were expensive. A weed-choked island with rats and no wildlife was not a conservation priority. It was a building site. No one in any official role believed Moyenne was worth preserving. No one imagined that a single man without a science degree would accomplish what entire institutions hadn't even bothered to attempt. The island went on the market because it was cheap and apparently useless. That was the expert assessment. That was the real failure of the conventional approach, not a project that launched and then collapsed, but a system that looked at Moyenne and concluded it wasn't worth the trouble. Grimshaw was 37, a newspaper editor based in Nairobi, whose career was winding down as newly independent African nations reshaped their institutions. Vacationing in the Seychelles, a stranger mentioned an island for sale at £8,000. Grimshaw went out that same afternoon and bought it on the spot. Standing on the beach, staring at the knotted mess of dead growth, he later recalled, "It was a special feeling. This is the place I've been looking for." He found a partner, René Lafortune, a 19-year-old son of a local fisherman whose father had worked the waters around Moyenne for decades. René understood the island's layout, its tides, its weather rhythm. He wasn't just an extra pair of hands. He was a reservoir of local knowledge. The two of them did what no institution had bothered to try. They went after the root of the problem. The thinking behind it wasn't complex, but the physical work was punishing. Invasive weeds were suffocating the native plants, so they ripped them out. By hand. Patch by patch, hacking through the tangle, stripping away everything that was blocking light and space for native species to survive. Conservation efforts elsewhere in the Seychelles brought in heavy machinery, hired trained crews, and burned through hundreds of thousands in funding. Grimshaw and René showed up with hand tools and earned blisters. No engines, no budget line, just shovels, sweat, and time. As they cleared sections, they planted. Palm, mango, pawpaw, mahogany, every native species they could source from neighboring islands went into the soil. There was no plumbing, no irrigation infrastructure. For years, they rowed back to the mainland, filled barrels with fresh water, and hauled them uphill by hand. The work didn't stop for storms, for fatigue, or for doubt. Grimshaw relocated to the island permanently in 1972, fully committing himself. Over the span of their partnership, the two of them planted 16,000 trees and carved out 4.8 kilometers of walking paths through the emerging forest, the first deliberate human footprint the island had seen in half a century. The birds were next, though the method was anything but sophisticated. Grimshaw ferried 10 birds over from a nearby island. They flew straight back. He tried a second time. A few stayed. He fed them. Others followed. As the trees grew tall enough to fruit, more birds arrived, and then still more. The chain reaction was simple. Clearing created room for trees. Trees produced food. Food attracted birds. Birds scattered seeds that grew into more trees. Grimshaw hadn't designed a bird reintroduction program. He had removed the blockage and let the natural sequence resume on its own. The tortoises took more careful handling. The Aldabra giant tortoise was native to the Seychelles, but had gone locally extinct on most islands, crowded out by construction and development. Grimshaw brought a small breeding group to Moyenne and raised the youngest hatchlings in his own bedroom until they were big enough to fend for themselves, painting identification numbers on their shells so he could monitor each one. He kept a detailed record of every animal, its size, its habits, the routes it traced across the island. Well, the tortoises weren't there for show. They served a function, moving through the brush, eating vegetation, dropping seeds behind them, performing the slow, grinding maintenance of a forest floor that no machine or human could replicate at that scale. From the outside, none of this was dramatic. For years, it simply looked like a man living on a tiny island, planting trees, scattering birdseed, and tending tortoises. The developers who came by with checkbooks saw what he was building and wrote him off as an eccentric nature lover squandering a prime piece of real estate. Grimshaw didn't bother arguing with them. He didn't call press conferences or submit research papers. He went back to the island and kept at it. The proof was coming. It just needed a few more decades to arrive. The turning point on Moyenne wasn't a single dramatic event. It was a gradual acceleration. The trees Grimshaw and Lafortune had planted started reaching full growth. The mahogany trees, 700 of them, climbed to 60 or 70 feet. The canopy knitted together above the walking paths. The island that had been a strangled mess of dead invasive growth became something unrecognizable, a layered, functioning forest with shade and structure and humidity and birdsong pouring from every direction. Anyone who waded ashore in the 1980s or 1990s was stepping into a world that hadn't existed 2 decades before, a complete forest system on a piece of ground that had been biologically lifeless when Grimshaw showed up. The birds he had lured to the island with seed and persistence became a thriving population. Species that hadn't appeared on Moyenne in decades started showing up. The pigeon hollandaise, named for its Dutch flag markings, came back. The red footy weaver bird, originally from Madagascar, settled into the canopy. Hawksbill turtles began nesting along the beaches. By the time Grimshaw reached old age on the island, more than 2,000 birds from numerous species inhabited 24 acres that had supported 0 birds 4 decades earlier. The island had quietly become a working demonstration project that nobody had financed and nobody had requested. The tortoise effort became one of the most understated conservation achievements in the Seychelles. From the small group Grimshaw had introduced, the population expanded to 120 giant Aldabra tortoises. The oldest, christened Desmond after Grimshaw's godson, had reached 76 years old by 2012. These animals had been vanishing across the Seychelles as development consumed their territory. Conservation bodies with proper funding and professional teams were struggling to keep viable tortoise numbers on designated reserves. On Moyenne, with no institutional backing and no formal protocol, the tortoises were flourishing. That outcome was not something the conservation community had forecasted for a private citizen working alone. When René Lafortune died in 2007, after more than 4 decades working side by side with Grimshaw, the situation sharpened. Grimshaw was 81, with no children and no successor. The purchase offers had intensified as the island's transformation grew too visible to dismiss. Turning down bids was not a permanent safeguard. He needed legal protection for the island, and he needed it established while he was still around to fight for it. A Saudi prince had already put $50 million on the table. Grimshaw's response was to ask what would become of the tortoises, what would become of the birds. The prince gave no answer that satisfied him. Grimshaw declined. He had been rejecting offers for decades, posing the same questions each time, and no one with money had ever returned with a proposal that prioritized the ecosystem. So he turned to the Seychelles government instead, making the case that Moyenne was no longer a personal ecological experiment. It was a functional, self-sustaining national resource. In 2008, the government agreed. Moyenne Island was officially declared a national park, the smallest in the world. In 2009, Grimshaw signed a permanent trust with the Seychelles Ministry of Environment, cementing the island's protected status in law. The experts had insisted you needed credentials, budgets, and programs. Grimshaw had relied on a shovel, a local partner, and patience measured in decades. The government that had no strategy for Moyenne in 1962 had to draft an entirely new legal instrument in 2008 to accommodate what a single private individual had quietly constructed. Moyenne Island today bears no resemblance to the place Grimshaw purchased in 1962. The 24 acres he acquired for roughly $10,000 now holds 16,000 trees, among them a mahogany forest with a canopy stretching 60 to 70 feet overhead. More than 2,000 birds from dozens of native species occupy land that housed not a single bird when Grimshaw first arrived. The island sustains 120 giant Aldabra tortoises, a species that had gone locally extinct across most of the Seychelles by the time he launched his breeding efforts. The surrounding waters support hawksbill turtles and coral reef systems that benefit directly from the stabilized land above the waterline. Root networks anchoring soil that would otherwise wash into the ocean, nutrients flowing from the forest canopy into the shallows below. The figures become more remarkable from there. Moyenne now hosts 2/3 of all plant species found only in the Seychelles. By some estimates, it contains more plant species per square mile than any other national park in the world. The island that had 4 surviving tree species in 1962 now holds greater botanical richness per square meter than reserves many times its size, reserves managed by teams of trained ecologists backed by government funding. All of it assembled on 24 acres by 2 men without a single dollar of institutional money. The man everyone told was throwing his life away turned down $50 million to keep it that way. Grimshaw died on July 3, 2012, at 86 years old, and was buried on the island beside his father. His gravestone reads, "Moyenne taught him to open his eyes to the beauty around him and say thank you to God." The island is now managed by the Moyenne Island Foundation. Visitors arrive by boat from Mahé, wade onto the shore. There is no dock, just as Grimshaw wanted, and are capped at 50 at a time. No hotels, no construction. His will contained a clause forbidding any development permanently. The investors who had once orbited the island with offers and architectural plans discovered that Grimshaw had legally sealed every avenue before he died. The island cannot be sold. It cannot be built on. It cannot be turned into anything other than what it already is. And what it already is happens to be one of the most ecologically concentrated pieces of land on the planet. Scientists who have studied Moyenne since its national park designation have observed that the pace of its recovery from 4 tree species to a fully layered forest ecosystem in under 50 years is exceptional, even measured against deliberate, well-resourced conservation projects. Grimshaw accomplished in decades what some organized programs have failed to achieve across generations. The investors had a plan for Moyenne. The developers had a plan. The conventional calculus of island economics had a plan. Grimshaw disregarded every one of them, spent 46 years planting trees by hand and coaxing birds back, and transformed a dead piece of land into the smallest national park in the world. No institution bankrolled it. No government initiative built it. No credentialed ecologist drew up the blueprint. One man and a shovel. That was the whole operation. The most basic intervention, strip out what's broken, plant what belongs, give the system time, can outperform decades of expert neglect and millions in development capital. Grimshaw didn't wage war against the island's natural processes. He cleared the obstruction and let the system reboot itself. The investors stopped laughing when the government signed the National Park Agreement. They went quiet when he refused $50 million. Grimshaw never brought up either. He was too busy on the island doing the work. Subscribe for more stories about people who rebuilt the earth without waiting for permission.